frustrated. "Hey, Carter, you sure you won't blow up that rifle like your husband blew up secrets?" Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb laughs mockingly from the armory workshop doorway, his voice loud enough for all 12 personnel in the Fort Bragg weapons facility to hear clearly, reflective. Helen Carter didn't turn around, the heavy scent of CLP gun oil filling the 6 a.m. air, radio still broadcasting range cold from the firing range 200 yards away, her fingers continuing to glide over the bolt carrier group of the M4 carbine with perfect finger discipline. She continued turning the torque wrench precisely 25 foot-pounds, according to specification, eyes focused on the safety checklist on her clipboard without needing to consult the manual, habits of checking chamber and brass clearance like she'd done thousands of times before. Outside, formation was preparing for weapons qualification course, but Colonel Morrison stood at a distance, tapping his combat boot toe lightly and glancing at his watch. Nervous tells only a trained observer would recognize, pauses, until the radio crackled with a message that made the entire range suddenly fall silent.
Hamilton 1026 at last transmit.
Dramatic tone. The morning air at Fort Bragg carried the familiar mix of diesel exhaust from Humvees and the metallic tang of gun oil that had soaked into every surface of the weapons facility over decades of use. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the armory workshop, casting harsh shadows across workbenches lined with disassembled rifle components, cleaning rods, and precision tools, reflective. Helen Carter had arrived at 0530 hours, 30 minutes before the official start of the weapons maintenance shift, a habit that had served her well in her 3 years as a civilian contractor at the base. Ig. Webb's cruel words hung in the air like smoke from a misfired round. The 12 personnel in the workshop, a mix of armorers, technicians, and soldiers preparing for qualification, pretended to focus on their tasks while stealing glances at Helen. Some looked uncomfortable with Webb's harassment, but none spoke up. The moral vacuum was palpable, a collective failure to uphold the standards that military personnel were supposed to embody. Helen's response was silence and professionalism. She completed the torque specification on the barrel nut, her movements economical and precise. Every motion spoke of extensive training and experience that went far beyond what a typical weapons technician would possess. She checked the chamber with the practiced ease of someone who had performed thousands of similar inspections, her finger automatically finding the magazine release to ensure the weapon was completely clear. Range control, rifle number 7 maintenance complete, safety protocols verified, chamber clear and locked. Helen spoke into her shoulder-mounted radio, her voice steady and professional. The radio discipline was flawless, no unnecessary chatter, proper call signs, clear pronunciation that cut through static. Staff Sergeant Webb stepped further into the workshop, emboldened by the lack of resistance. "I'm serious, Carter. Maybe stick to filing paperwork. Leave the real weapons work to people who actually belong in the military." His comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles from younger soldiers who felt pressured to show allegiance to a senior NCO, even when his behavior clearly violated Army values. Helen methodically placed the torque wrench back in its designated slot in the tool rack, each tool returning to its precise location. Her tool organization was military standard perfect. Every item had a place, and everything was in its place. She picked up the next weapon from the maintenance queue, an M4 carbine that had been flagged for trigger mechanism inspection. Outside the workshop, the sounds of a military base coming to life filled the morning air. Boots marched in formation on concrete, diesel engines rumbled to life in the motor pool, and the distant sound of PT formations calling cadence echoed across the compound. But inside the weapons facility, an uncomfortable tension had settled over the workspace. Chief Warrant Officer Torres entered the workshop carrying his morning coffee and a clipboard, thick with inspection schedules. At 48 years old, Torres had spent 26 years in the Army, starting as an enlisted soldier and working his way up through the warrant officer ranks. He'd seen enough harassment and unprofessional behavior to recognize it immediately, but he also understood the delicate dynamics of dealing with senior NCOs who had their own power bases within the unit. "Morning, people," Torres announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We've got 38 weapons scheduled for qualification prep today, and range time starts at 0800 hours. I need everything squared away and inspected before we move to the firing line." Torres' eyes swept the workshop, taking in the subtle tension that lingered in the air. He'd noticed Webb's pattern of targeting Helen Carter over the past several months, always stopping just short of behavior that would require official intervention. It was the kind of sophisticated bullying that experienced NCOs had perfected, cruel enough to be effective, but careful enough to avoid formal consequences. Helen had moved on to the trigger mechanism inspection, her fingers working with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. She disassembled the fire control group methodically, laying out each component in the exact order it would be reassembled. Her handling of the trigger spring and disconnector showed a level of familiarity that suggested extensive experience with weapon systems far beyond basic maintenance. "Carter," Webb called out again, unwilling to let the harassment drop. "Hope you're not installing any special modifications that might help our enemies. Wouldn't want another Carter family tradition of compromising operational security." The reference to Helen's deceased husband hit like a physical blow. Master Sergeant David Carter had died in military prison 3 years earlier, convicted of passing classified information to foreign agents. The case had been sensational within military circles. A decorated soldier with multiple combat deployments, married to his high school sweetheart, suddenly exposed as a traitor who had sold intelligence for money. The conviction had destroyed not only David's reputation, but had cast suspicion on anyone associated with him, including his widow. Helen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued her work without responding. Her finger discipline remained perfect as she inspected the trigger mechanism, checking for wear patterns, proper spring tension, and smooth operation. The inspection was thorough and professional, following technical manuals to the letter. Chief Torres stepped closer to Helen's workbench, ostensibly to review her progress, but actually positioning himself to intervene if Webb's harassment escalated further. "How's the trigger group looking, Carter?" he asked, his tone neutral but supportive. "Within specifications, Chief," Helen replied, her voice steady. "Spring tension is correct, no excessive wear on contact surfaces. Trigger brake is clean at 4.5 pounds. Ready for test firing." Her technical vocabulary was precise, using the exact terminology found in Army technical manuals. Torres nodded approvingly. Over the past 3 years, Helen Carter's work had been consistently excellent. Her maintenance reports were thorough, her safety record was spotless, and weapons she prepared never failed during qualification courses. If anything, her performance exceeded that of many military personnel with formal training. "Outstanding," Torres said, loud enough for the entire workshop to hear. "Carter, when you finish that weapon, I want you to handle the scope mounting for the designated marksman rifles. We need precision work on those." The assignment was significant. Designated marksman rifles required extremely precise scope mounting, with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. The weapons were used by specialized soldiers who needed to engage targets at extended ranges with high accuracy. It was technical work typically reserved for the most skilled armorers. Staff Sergeant Webb's expression darkened. "Chief, maybe someone with actual military training should handle the precision weapons. We can't afford mistakes when soldiers' lives are on the line." Torres turned to face Webb directly, his voice carrying the edge of authority. "Sergeant Webb, Carter's track record speaks for itself. 0 weapons failures, 0 safety incidents, and consistently excellent performance reviews. Unless you have specific technical concerns about her work, I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities." The rebuke was delivered in professional language, but the message was clear. Torres was not going to tolerate further harassment of his personnel, regardless of their civilian status or personal history. The workshop fell silent as other personnel recognized the shift in dynamics. Webb's face flushed with anger, but he was experienced enough to recognize when a senior warrant officer was drawing a line. He muttered something under his breath and moved to the far side of the workshop, but his resentment was obvious to everyone present. Helen finished reassembling the trigger mechanism and conducted a function check, pulling the trigger while ensuring the weapon was pointed in a safe direction. The trigger broke cleanly, the reset was crisp, and the safety engaged and disengaged smoothly. Her testing was thorough and methodical, following every step of the technical procedures. "Rifle number 8 complete and ready for final inspection," she announced, placing the weapon in the completed rack. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, never wasted motion or unnecessary delays. Torres approached Helen's workstation and conducted his own inspection of the completed weapon. He checked the trigger mechanism, verified the torque specifications on critical bolts, and examined the overall condition of the rifle. Everything was perfect, better than perfect actually. The weapon looked like it had been prepared by someone with years of specialized training. "Excellent work, Carter," Torres said, making a note on his inspection sheet. "Move on to the designated marksman rifles when you're ready." Helen nodded and walked to the secured cabinet where the designated marksman rifles were stored. These weapons were different from standard infantry rifles: longer barrels for improved accuracy, adjustable stocks for proper fit, and mounting systems for high-powered scopes. They required specialized knowledge and extreme precision in maintenance and preparation. As Helen unlocked the secure cabinet, her movements betrayed a familiarity with specialized weapons that went beyond basic training. She handled the designated marksman rifle with the easy confidence of someone who had extensive experience with precision shooting systems. Her finger automatically found the safety, checked the chamber, and verified the weapon was clear before beginning her inspection. The rifle was a modified M14 platform, rebuilt for designated marksman use with a precision barrel, adjustable trigger, and specialized scope mounting system. Helen examined the weapon with a systematic approach that suggested extensive knowledge of precision shooting systems. She checked the barrel crown for damage, examined the trigger group for wear, and tested the adjustable stock mechanism. Staff Sergeant Webb watched from across the workshop, his expression growing more hostile as he observed Helen's obvious competence with specialized weapons. In his mind, her skill was further evidence of suspicious behavior. How did a civilian contractor develop such extensive knowledge of military weapons systems? Why was she so comfortable with precision rifles that most soldiers never even saw, let alone worked on? Helen began the scope mounting process, selecting a high-powered telescopic sight from the specialized equipment locker. The scope was military specification, built to withstand harsh conditions while maintaining zero calibration under extreme stress. Mounting it properly required precise measurements, careful alignment, and specialized tools. She placed the rifle in a precision vise that held it perfectly stable while she worked. The scope rings had to be positioned exactly to achieve proper eye relief and optimal scope height. Helen used a specialized measuring tool to ensure the rings were perfectly aligned, checking and rechecking measurements before making any permanent attachments. Her technique was flawless. She applied thread-locking compound to the mounting screws, torqued them to exact specifications, and used a leveling system to ensure the scope was perfectly aligned with the rifle's bore. The process took nearly 45 minutes, but every step was performed with meticulous attention to detail. Webb couldn't contain his suspicion any longer. "Chief Torres, don't you think it's strange how comfortable Carter is with sniper weapons? Most civilians wouldn't even know how to properly mount a scope, let alone handle specialized military equipment." Torres looked up from his paperwork, his expression neutral but alert. Webb's question touched on a concern that had occurred to him as well. Helen's technical skills were exceptional, even by military standards. Her familiarity with weapon systems and procedures suggested training far beyond what a typical civilian contractor would possess. "Carter received comprehensive training before being certified for this position," Torres replied carefully. "All civilian contractors working with weapon systems must pass extensive background checks and demonstrate technical competency." It was true, but it didn't fully explain Helen's level of expertise. Torres had seen military armorers with years of experience who couldn't match her precision and efficiency. Her knowledge of weapon systems seemed intuitive, automatic, like muscle memory developed over years of intensive training. Helen completed the scope mounting and conducted a preliminary bore sighting procedure. She used a specialized tool that allowed her to look through the rifle's barrel while simultaneously adjusting the scope to align with the bore axis. The process required steady hands and precise adjustments, skills that typically took months to develop. "Initial bore sight complete," Helen announced, "ready for range verification when time permits." Torres examined her work, checking the scope mounting with his own measuring tools. The alignment was perfect, the torque specifications were correct, and the overall installation was textbook quality. He made notes on his inspection sheet, rating the work as exceeding standards. "Outstanding work, Carter," Torres said. "That's precision installation quality. Take 15 minutes for coffee, then start on the next rifle." Helen nodded and stepped away from her workstation. She walked to the small break area in the corner of the workshop, where a coffee pot and vending machine provided basic refreshments for the staff. Her movements were controlled and purposeful, never hurried or careless. As she poured coffee into a paper cup, Helen was acutely aware of the conversations happening around her. 3 years of working at Fort Bragg had taught her to listen without appearing to eavesdrop. to gather information while maintaining the appearance of a simple civilian contractor. "I don't care what Torres says," Webb was telling another soldier, in a voice just loud enough for Helen to hear. "There's something not right about her. Nobody gets that good with weapons without serious training, and her husband was a traitor. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." The other soldier, a young corporal named Jackson, looked uncomfortable with the conversation. "Sergeant, maybe we should focus on the work. She seems to know what she's doing, and Chief Torres trusts her." Webb's expression hardened. "Jackson, you're too naive. Carter's husband sold secrets to our enemies, got soldiers killed, and died in prison for treason. Now his widow shows up here with suspicious weapons skills and unlimited access to our weapons systems. Connect the dots." Helen sipped her coffee and pretended to read a technical manual while listening to the exchange. Webb's paranoia was becoming more pronounced, and his influence over younger soldiers was concerning. He was building a narrative that painted her as a security threat, using her husband's conviction as evidence of her own guilt by association. The truth was far more complicated than anyone at Fort Bragg realized. Helen Carter wasn't just a civilian contractor with unusual skills. She wasn't even Helen Carter, technically speaking. Her real name was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, and she was a counterintelligence specialist who had spent the last 3 years conducting one of the most complex undercover operations in military history. The operation had begun 4 years earlier, when intelligence analysts discovered evidence that David Carter might have been framed for treason. Someone with high-level access had orchestrated his conviction, using him as a scapegoat to cover their own illegal activities. The real traitor was still active, still in position to cause damage, and still unknown to military investigators. Sarah Mitchell had volunteered for the undercover assignment, assuming the identity of David Carter's widow and infiltrating Fort Bragg to identify the real traitor. It had required extensive preparation, learning civilian contractor procedures, developing a believable backstory, and suppressing her own military bearing and training to appear like an ordinary civilian. For 3 years, she had endured harassment, suspicion, and isolation while conducting one of the most challenging investigations of her career. Every day brought new risks of discovery, new challenges to her cover identity, and new opportunities to gather intelligence about the real conspiracy that had destroyed David Carter's life. Helen finished her coffee and returned to her workstation. The next designated marksman rifle was waiting for scope mounting, and she began the familiar process of precision measurement and careful installation. Her movements remained controlled and professional, giving no hint of the complex thoughts running through her mind. Staff Sergeant Webb continued his surveillance from across the workshop, noting every detail of Helen's work with growing suspicion. In his paranoid worldview, her competence was evidence of deception, her professionalism was suspicious, and her presence at Fort Bragg was a threat to national security. What Webb didn't realize was that his hostility toward Helen was actually providing cover for her real mission. His harassment made her appear vulnerable and isolated, deflecting attention from her true purpose. The cruel irony was that Webb's cruelty was inadvertently protecting the very investigation that would eventually expose the real traitor at Fort Bragg. Chief Torres continued his morning inspections, moving from workstation to workstation and reviewing the progress of various maintenance tasks. His experienced eye caught details that less experienced supervisors might miss: the quality of tool organization, the efficiency of work procedures, and the overall professionalism of his personnel. When Torres reached Helen's workstation, he observed her scope mounting procedure with professional interest. Her technique was textbook perfect, but more than that, it was intuitive and efficient in ways that suggested extensive experience. She anticipated problems before they occurred, selected tools without hesitation, and made adjustments with the precision of someone who had performed similar tasks hundreds of times. "Carter," Torres said quietly, "where did you learn precision scope mounting? This level of work usually requires specialized military training." Helen paused in her work, considering her response carefully. Her cover story was well rehearsed and documented, but it required constant reinforcement to remain believable. "My husband taught me the basics before his deployment," she said, her voice neutral. "I practiced on civilian rifles to stay connected to something he loved." It was a plausible explanation that fit with her cover identity as a grieving widow, seeking connection to her deceased husband's interests. The emotional component made the story more believable and discouraged further questioning about technical details. Torres nodded, accepting the explanation, but filing away his observations for future consideration. Helen Carter was clearly more skilled than her background suggested, but there could be legitimate explanations for her expertise. Military spouses often develop technical skills through informal training with their deployed partners. Helen completed the second scope mounting and conducted another bore sighting procedure. Her movements remained precise and methodical, following established procedures while incorporating efficiency improvements that spoke of extensive experience. The completed installation was flawless, meeting and exceeding military specifications. "Second rifle complete and ready for range verification," Helen announced, placing the weapon in the completed rack next to the first designated marksman rifle. Torres examined her work with increasing respect for her technical abilities. Both rifles were perfectly prepared, with scope installations that exceeded the quality of work typically performed by military armorers. Helen Carter was clearly wasted in a basic maintenance position, but her civilian status limited advancement opportunities within the military system. The morning routine continued, with Helen moving on to standard M4 carbines that required basic maintenance and preparation for qualification courses. The work was routine compared to precision rifle preparation, but Helen approached it with the same methodical professionalism that characterized all her tasks. As she worked, Helen remained alert to conversations and activities throughout the workshop. Her counterintelligence training had taught her to gather information constantly, listening for details that might advance her investigation into David Carter's framing. Every piece of gossip, every casual comment, every observation of personnel behavior was potentially valuable intelligence. Staff Sergeant Webb's hostility was actually providing unexpected benefits for her mission. His harassment created natural opportunities for supportive personnel to share information with her, viewing her as an underdog worthy of protection. People who might otherwise be cautious about discussing base activities were more willing to confide in someone they perceived as vulnerable and isolated. The radio crackled with range control updates as morning activities continued across Fort Bragg. Range control to all stations. Weapons qualification course will commence at 0800 hours. All personnel report to designated firing positions with assigned weapons and ammunition. Helen glanced at the clock on the workshop wall. 0745 hours. In 15 minutes, the morning's maintenance work would transition to actual weapons qualification, where the rifles she had prepared would be tested under live fire conditions. It was always a moment of professional pride when weapons performed flawlessly during qualification courses. Chief Torres began organizing the completed weapons for transport to the firing range. Each rifle had been inspected, tested, and certified ready for use. The paperwork was complete, safety checks were documented, and ammunition allocations were verified. Everything was proceeding according to the standard procedures. "All right, people," Torres announced. "Time to move to the range. Grab your assigned weapons and follow safety protocols for transport. No horseplay, no shortcuts, and no exceptions to established procedures." Helen secured her workstation and prepared to accompany the group to the firing range. As a civilian contractor, she wasn't required to participate in qualification courses, but she often observed to ensure her maintenance work met performance standards under actual firing conditions. The walk to the firing range took 5 minutes across well-maintained paths that connected various facilities at Fort Bragg. The morning air was crisp and clear, with visibility excellent for precision shooting. Weather conditions were optimal for weapons qualification, with minimal wind and good lighting. The firing range itself was a sophisticated facility designed to accommodate various weapon systems and training scenarios. Concrete firing positions were separated by protective barriers, with target systems positioned at measured distances from 25 yards to 600 yards. Electronic scoring systems provided immediate feedback on shot placement and accuracy. Range safety officers were already in position, conducting final inspections of targets and safety equipment. Red warning lights indicated that the range was still cold, meaning no live ammunition was permitted forward of the safety line. The range would remain cold until all personnel were properly positioned and safety procedures were completed. Helen took a position in the observation area, where she could monitor the performance of weapons she had prepared while staying clear of active firing positions. Her vantage point provided excellent visibility of the entire range and allowed her to assess the effectiveness of her maintenance work. Colonel Morrison appeared at the observation deck above the firing positions, an elevated platform that provided range commanders with comprehensive oversight of training activities. His presence was unusual. Base commanders rarely observe routine qualification courses, unless there were special circumstances or important visitors. Morrison stood with his arms crossed, scanning the range with what appeared to be casual interest. But Helen noticed subtle signs of tension in his posture, slightly elevated shoulders, frequent glances at his watch, and a tendency to shift his weight from foot to foot. These were stress indicators that suggested Morrison was more concerned about the qualification course than routine observation would warrant. The range safety officer's voice echoed across the facility through the public address system. "Range control to all personnel. Prepare for hot range conditions. All weapons will be loaded with live ammunition on my command. Maintain muzzle discipline and follow all safety protocols." Helen watched as soldiers took their assigned firing positions, each carrying a rifle that had been prepared during the morning maintenance session. The weapons gleamed with fresh oil and precision adjustments, ready to perform under the demanding conditions of military qualification standards. Staff Sergeant Webb positioned himself at firing lane 7, carrying one of the standard M4 carbines that Helen had prepared. His expression was determined, clearly intent on demonstrating superior marksmanship that would contrast with any civilian's theoretical knowledge of weapons systems. Chief Torres moved among the firing positions, conducting final safety inspections and ensuring that all personnel understood the qualification course requirements. His experienced eye checked weapon orientation, safety selector positions, and overall readiness for live fire exercises. "The range is now hot," the safety officer announced. "Load weapons with 1 magazine, 30 rounds of ammunition. Keep weapons pointed downrange at all times. Commence firing on my command." The familiar sounds of weapons being loaded filled the range, magazines being inserted, bolts being charged, and safety selectors being moved to the fire position. Helen watched the process with professional interest, noting the smooth operation of weapons she had maintained. From his position on the observation deck, Colonel Morrison's attention seemed focused on Helen rather than the soldiers preparing to fire. His gaze lingered on her with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest in a civilian contractor's presence at the range. Morrison reached for a communication device, speaking quietly into what appeared to be a secure radio or phone. His conversation was brief but animated, with gestures that suggested he was providing descriptions or requesting information about someone specific. Helen noticed Morrison's behavior, but maintained her focus on the weapons qualification course. Her cover required her to appear interested primarily in the technical performance of equipment, rather than personnel dynamics or command activities. "Commence firing," the range safety officer commanded. The range erupted with the controlled chaos of multiple weapons firing simultaneously. Brass casings ejected from rifles and clattered on concrete, gunpowder smoke began to accumulate in the morning air, and the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed across Fort Bragg. Helen observed the performance of each weapon she had prepared, noting smooth cycling, consistent ejection patterns, and steady accuracy from properly maintained rifles. The designated marksman rifles performed exceptionally well, with tight shot groups that demonstrated the value of precision scope mounting and careful preparation. Staff Sergeant Webb's rifle functioned flawlessly, despite his obvious disappointment that Helen's maintenance work was performing without any problems. His shooting was competent but not exceptional, scoring within acceptable parameters for his rank and experience level. Morrison continued his observation from the elevated platform, but his attention remained focused on Helen rather than the qualification course. His behavior was becoming increasingly obvious, drawing curious glances from other personnel who noticed the base commander's unusual interest in a civilian contractor. Helen's counterintelligence training had taught her to recognize surveillance patterns and unusual attention from authority figures. Morrison's behavior was definitely outside normal parameters, suggesting that something had triggered his interest in her activities or background. During a ceasefire period while targets were evaluated, Helen noticed Morrison speaking into his communication device again. This conversation was longer and more animated than the first, with Morrison occasionally gesturing in her direction while maintaining what he thought was discreet observation. Something was developing that could threaten her cover or compromise her mission. Helen began mentally reviewing her preparations for potential exposure, considering evacuation procedures and evidence protection protocols that might become necessary if her investigation was discovered. The qualification course continued with soldiers advancing to longer-range targets that required greater precision and skill. The weapons Helen had prepared continued to perform flawlessly, validating her maintenance procedures and technical expertise. But the technical success of her work was becoming secondary to the growing tension surrounding Morrison's intense interest in her presence. Something had triggered his suspicion or recognition, and the implications could be catastrophic for her undercover mission. Helen maintained her professional demeanor while internally preparing for the possibility that 3 years of careful investigation might be about to unravel. Whatever had caught Morrison's attention was serious enough to warrant immediate communication with unknown parties, and his behavior suggested that her cover identity might be compromised. The radio in Morrison's hand crackled with an incoming transmission that was loud enough for Helen to hear fragments of the conversation. The words she caught made her blood run cold: ballistic signature analysis and database match probability. Morrison's face went pale as he listened to the transmission, his eyes widening with what appeared to be recognition and growing panic. He stepped back from the observation deck railing, nearly stumbling in his haste to distance himself from the range activities below. Helen realized with crystalline clarity that something in her performance or behavior had triggered a database search that was revealing more information than her cover identity could withstand. Morrison's reaction suggested that her real identity as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell was about to be exposed, along with her 3-year undercover investigation. The morning sun climbed higher over Fort Bragg, casting longer shadows across the firing range as the weapons qualification course continued. Helen Carter maintained her position in the observation area, but her awareness was now split between monitoring the technical performance of weapons she had prepared and tracking Colonel Morrison's increasingly agitated behavior on the elevated platform. Morrison paced the length of the observation deck, his radio pressed close to his ear as he carried on what appeared to be an urgent conversation. His body language had shifted from casual observation to obvious distress, with rapid gestures and frequent glances toward Helen's position that were no longer subtle or discreet. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Helen. For 3 years, she had carefully maintained her cover as a grieving widow seeking meaningful work related to her deceased husband's military service. She had endured harassment, suspicion, and isolation while methodically gathering evidence about the conspiracy that had destroyed David Carter's life and reputation. Now, when she was finally closing in on definitive proof of Morrison's guilt, her own exceptional performance was threatening to expose her true identity. The very skills that made her an effective undercover operative were creating patterns that military databases could analyze and potentially match to her real service record. Helen's mind raced through the possibilities. Modern military databases contained extensive information about personnel performance, training records, and specialized skills. If Morrison had requested an analysis of her technical abilities or behavioral patterns, sophisticated algorithms might identify correlations with military personnel who possessed similar capabilities. The challenge was that Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell's service record included extensive counterintelligence training, advanced marksmanship qualifications, and specialized technical schools that would create exactly the kind of capability profile that Helen Carter was inadvertently demonstrating through her work performance. Staff Sergeant Webb completed his firing sequence and moved to the weapon clearing area, where range safety officers verified that rifles were unloaded and safe before personnel could leave their firing positions. His M4 carbine had performed flawlessly throughout the qualification course, a fact that clearly frustrated his desire to find fault with Helen's maintenance work. Webb approached the observation area where Helen was standing, his expression combining disappointment with renewed suspicion. "Carter," he said, his voice carrying enough volume to be heard by nearby personnel, "I have to admit your rifle maintenance was adequate, but I still think there's something suspicious about your technical knowledge." Helen turned to face Webb, maintaining the calm professionalism that had characterized her behavior throughout 3 years of similar confrontations. "Thank you for the feedback, Sergeant Webb. I'm glad the rifle performed to your satisfaction during qualification." Her response was deliberately measured and non-confrontational, designed to avoid escalating tensions while demonstrating the kind of respectful deference that was expected from civilian contractors interacting with military personnel. But Webb wasn't satisfied with professional courtesy. "Where exactly did you learn precision shooting techniques?" Webb pressed. "Your scope mounting work is better than most military armorers, and that kind of skill doesn't develop from casual hobby shooting." The question was pointed and specific, designed to probe for inconsistencies in Helen's cover story. Webb had clearly been observing her work with increasing suspicion, and his interrogation was becoming more focused and potentially dangerous to her mission. Helen considered her response carefully. Her cover story needed to remain consistent with previous explanations while providing sufficient detail to satisfy Webb's curiosity without revealing information that could compromise her real identity. "My husband was very passionate about precision shooting," Helen replied, her voice carrying a subtle note of sadness that reinforced her cover identity as a grieving widow. "He spent his leave time teaching me technical procedures because he said it helped him stay sharp between deployments. After he died, I continued practicing because it made me feel connected to his memory." The explanation was emotionally plausible and consistent with her established background. Military spouses often developed technical hobbies as a way to maintain connection with deployed partners, and continuing such activities after losing a spouse was a common coping mechanism. Webb's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but the emotional component of Helen's response made further aggressive questioning socially uncomfortable. Attacking a widow's attempts to honor her deceased husband's memory would be seen as unnecessarily cruel, even by personnel who shared Webb's suspicions about Helen's background. Chief Torres approached the group, carrying his clipboard and wearing the satisfied expression of a supervisor whose equipment had performed flawlessly during demanding tests. "Outstanding performance across the board," he announced. "Zero weapon malfunctions, excellent accuracy scores, and no safety incidents." That's exactly what professional maintenance produces. Torres's praise was directed toward all the maintenance personnel, but his eyes lingered on Helen with obvious approval. Her work had consistently exceeded standards, and the weapons qualification results validated his decision to assign her to precision weapons maintenance despite Webb's objections. "Carter," Torres continued, "your scope mounting on the designated marksman rifles was exceptional. Both weapons achieved superior accuracy scores that exceeded qualification requirements. Whatever training you received was clearly comprehensive and effective." The public recognition of Helen's technical excellence was professionally gratifying, but strategically dangerous. Every compliment and acknowledgement of her skills added to the pattern of exceptional performance that could trigger more sophisticated analysis of her background and capabilities. Morrison's radio conversation ended abruptly, and Helen noticed him moving rapidly toward the stairwell that connected the observation deck to the range floor. His movements were urgent and purposeful, suggesting that whatever information he had received required immediate action. Helen's counterintelligence training activated threat assessment protocols as she evaluated Morrison's approach. His body language indicated high stress and potential aggression, with rapid movements and focused attention that suggested he was operating under significant pressure to resolve an immediate problem. Morrison reached the range floor and approached the group of personnel gathered around Helen and Chief Torres. His arrival created an immediate shift in group dynamics, with everyone unconsciously straightening their posture and adopting more formal bearing in response to the base commander's presence. "Chief Torres," Morrison said, his voice carrying an undertone of tension that was obvious to anyone with experience reading military authority figures. "I need to speak with Ms. Carter privately regarding some administrative matters." The request was phrased as routine business, but Morrison's demeanor suggested urgency that went beyond normal administrative procedures. His eyes remained fixed on Helen with an intensity that confirmed her suspicion that her cover identity was facing serious compromise. Torres looked confused by the unusual request. "Sir, is there a specific issue with Ms. Carter's work performance? Her maintenance records are excellent, and today's qualification results validate the quality of her technical work." Morrison's jaw tightened slightly at Torres's defensive response. "This isn't about her work performance, Chief. There are some background verification issues that need to be addressed immediately. Ms. Carter, please accompany me to my office." Helen's mind raced through her options as Morrison's request created a crisis point for her undercover mission. Refusing to comply with a direct order from the base commander would be suspicious and potentially dangerous, but accompanying Morrison to a private location could expose her to interrogation, or worse if he had discovered her real identity. "Of course, Colonel," Helen replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. "Should I collect my equipment and secure my workstation first?" The question served multiple purposes. It demonstrated normal concern for proper procedures, created a brief delay that might provide strategic options, and allowed her to access her toolkit where certain emergency items were concealed among legitimate maintenance equipment. Morrison's impatience was becoming more obvious with each passing second. "Your equipment will be secured by base personnel. This matter requires immediate attention," Helen nodded and stepped away from her workstation, but as she moved, her hand brushed against her toolkit in what appeared to be an unconscious gesture. In reality, she was activating a concealed recording device that would document whatever confrontation was about to occur. The device was sophisticated military counterintelligence equipment, designed to appear as ordinary maintenance supplies while providing high-quality audio recording capability. If Morrison planned to threaten or interrogate her, the conversation would be documented as evidence of his guilt and her innocence. Staff Sergeant Webb watched the interaction with obvious satisfaction, clearly believing that his suspicions about Helen Carter were finally being validated by command attention. "I knew there was something wrong with her," he muttered to another soldier, loud enough for Helen to hear. Morrison began walking toward the administration building, with Helen following at the prescribed distance for a civilian accompanying a senior officer. His pace was rapid and purposeful, indicating urgency that reinforced Helen's assessment that a significant crisis was developing. As they walked across the base, Helen's awareness expanded to include potential escape routes, communication opportunities, and resources that might become necessary if her cover was blown and her safety was threatened. 3 years of undercover work had taught her to always maintain multiple contingency plans. The administration building housed the offices of senior command personnel, including Morrison's suite on the second floor. The building was heavily secured with multiple checkpoints and surveillance systems that would make any unauthorized departure extremely difficult. Morrison led Helen through the main entrance and past the security checkpoint, where military police personnel noted their passage but didn't interfere with what appeared to be routine business between the base commander and a civilian contractor. Helen's civilian identification badge provided appropriate access credentials for administrative areas. The elevator ride to the second floor was conducted in tense silence, with Morrison avoiding eye contact while Helen maintained the appearance of cooperative compliance. The confined space created an opportunity for Helen to observe Morrison's stress indicators more closely: elevated breathing, slight tremor in his hands, and perspiration that suggested extreme anxiety. Morrison's office was larger and more formal than typical military spaces, with awards, photographs, and military memorabilia that proclaimed his successful career and command authority. A large desk dominated the room, positioned to create psychological advantage during meetings with subordinates or visitors. "Please have a seat, Ms. Carter," Morrison said, gesturing toward a chair positioned directly in front of his desk. The seating arrangement was designed to create a power dynamic that favored the person behind the desk, a common interrogation technique used to establish psychological control. Helen sat down and maintained alert but relaxed posture, projecting cooperation while remaining prepared for rapid response if the situation became threatening. Her counterintelligence training included extensive preparation for exactly this type of confrontation. Morrison moved behind his desk but remained standing, using his height and position to create additional psychological pressure. His hands rested on the desktop, and Helen could see that his knuckles were white with tension. "Carter," Morrison began, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying undertones of barely contained anxiety. "I've received some concerning information about your background and qualifications that requires immediate clarification." Helen tilted her head slightly, projecting mild confusion and concern that would be appropriate for an innocent civilian contractor facing unexpected administrative scrutiny. "I'm not sure I understand, Colonel. Is there an issue with my security clearance or work performance?" Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Helen's expression, searching for signs of deception or recognition that might confirm his suspicions. "The issue is that your technical skills and knowledge appear to exceed what would be expected from someone with your documented background and training." The accusation was direct, but still vague enough to allow Helen multiple response options. Morrison was probing to see how she would react to suggestions that her cover story might be inadequate or incomplete. "Colonel," Helen replied, maintaining her tone of respectful confusion, "I've always been very thorough in my approach to technical work. My husband taught me to take precision seriously, and I've continued learning through practice and study. Is there a specific concern about my qualifications?" Morrison reached for a folder on his desk and opened it to reveal what appeared to be printouts of database queries and analysis reports. The documents were positioned so Helen couldn't read them clearly, but their official appearance suggested that significant resources had been devoted to investigating her background. "Ms. Carter," Morrison said, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone, Ballistics analysis of your scope mounting work shows precision levels that typically require years of specialized military training. Your technical knowledge and procedural familiarity exceed what civilian contractors normally possess. Helen felt her pulse quicken as Morrison's investigation appeared to be more sophisticated than she had anticipated. Modern military databases contained enormous amounts of information about personnel training, performance metrics, and technical capabilities that could potentially be cross-referenced to identify correlations between her demonstrated abilities and military service records. "Colonel," Helen responded, "I take my work very seriously because I understand that soldiers' lives depend on properly maintained equipment. If my attention to detail has raised concerns, I'm happy to provide additional documentation of my training and background." Morrison leaned forward across his desk, his eyes locked on Helen's face, as he delivered what was clearly intended as a decisive probe. "The problem, Ms. Carter, is that your performance patterns match those of military personnel with advanced counterintelligence training and specialized operations backgrounds." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Morrison had essentially accused her of being an undercover military operative, which was dangerously close to the truth. Helen's response would need to be carefully calibrated to deflect suspicion without creating additional inconsistencies in her cover story. "Colonel Morrison," Helen said, allowing a note of indignation to enter her voice, "I find your implications extremely offensive. I'm a widow who lost her husband to false accusations of treason, and now you're suggesting that I'm some kind of spy or infiltrator. That's both hurtful and completely unfounded." The emotional response was strategically calculated to put Morrison on the defensive, while reinforcing her cover identity as David Carter's grieving widow. Attacking a widow's loyalty and integrity would be seen as inappropriate behavior, even for a base commander conducting a legitimate security investigation. Morrison's expression showed uncertainty as Helen's emotional response forced him to consider the possibility that his suspicions might be wrong. Military officers were trained to be cautious about making accusations without solid evidence, particularly when dealing with civilians who had suffered personal tragedies. "Ms. Carter," Morrison said, his tone slightly more conciliatory, "I'm not making accusations. I'm simply trying to understand how someone with your background develops such advanced technical capabilities." Helen seized the opportunity to go on the offensive while maintaining her emotional appeal. "Colonel, my husband died in prison believing that his own military had abandoned him based on false evidence. Now you're questioning my loyalty and suggesting that I might be some kind of threat to national security. Don't you think the Carter family has suffered enough?" The reference to David Carter's case was strategically brilliant because it forced Morrison to confront the foundation of his own guilt. If Morrison was indeed the real traitor who had framed David Carter, then Helen's emotional appeal would create significant psychological pressure. Morrison's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale, and his hands gripped the edge of his desk with obvious tension. The mention of David Carter's case had clearly struck a nerve that went beyond professional concern about security issues. "Ms. Carter," Morrison said, his voice now noticeably strained, "the David Carter case was thoroughly investigated and resolved according to proper procedures. There's no reason to revisit those issues." Helen noticed the defensive tone in Morrison's response and decided to increase the pressure. "Colonel, resolved is an interesting word choice. My husband maintained his innocence until the day he died. He believed someone else was responsible for the security breaches he was blamed for." Morrison stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Helen as he struggled to control his visible distress. The mention of David Carter's continued claims of innocence was clearly creating significant psychological pressure for the real perpetrator of the crimes. "Ms. Carter," Morrison said without turning around, "conspiracy theories and unsupported allegations don't change the facts of a case that was properly adjudicated by military justice." Helen recognized that Morrison's defensive reactions were providing valuable intelligence about his involvement in David Carter's framing. His extreme discomfort with discussion of the case suggested personal knowledge that went beyond what would be expected from a base commander with only administrative awareness of the situation. The recording device concealed in Helen's toolkit was documenting the entire conversation, capturing Morrison's defensive responses and emotional reactions that would provide important evidence of his guilt. Every defensive statement and nervous reaction was being preserved as proof of his involvement in the conspiracy. Morrison turned back to face Helen, his expression showing signs of internal struggle as he wrestled with competing pressures. His investigation into Helen's background had revealed concerning correlations with military training, but her emotional appeals and references to David Carter were creating psychological stress that threatened his composure. "Ms. Carter," Morrison said, his voice now showing clear signs of strain, "I think this conversation has become more complex than necessary. Perhaps we should postpone further discussion until I can review additional information." Helen recognized that Morrison was trying to end the confrontation before his emotional reactions revealed too much information about his involvement in David Carter's case. His nervousness and defensive responses had already provided valuable intelligence, but she needed to maintain pressure to gather more definitive evidence. "Colonel Morrison," Helen said, rising from her chair and fixing him with direct eye contact, "I hope you understand that questions about my loyalty and implications about my background are extremely serious matters that affect my livelihood and reputation." Morrison nodded rapidly, clearly eager to end the uncomfortable conversation. "Of course, Ms. Carter. I'm sure we can resolve any administrative concerns through proper channels." Helen moved toward the door, but paused before leaving, delivering what she hoped would be a final psychological probe. "Colonel, I just hope that the military's treatment of my family doesn't become a pattern of false accusations and destroyed lives." Morrison's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His face flushed, his hands trembled slightly, and his voice cracked as he responded. "Ms. Carter, I can assure you that this base operates according to the highest standards of integrity and justice." The protest was too forceful and emotional for someone with a clear conscience discussing routine administrative matters. Morrison's extreme reaction to suggestions about false accusations provided strong evidence of his personal involvement in creating the very injustices Helen was describing. Helen left Morrison's office with confidence that her mission was approaching a successful conclusion. 3 years of careful investigation had finally produced definitive evidence of Morrison's guilt, documented by sophisticated recording equipment that would provide irrefutable proof of his involvement in David Carter's framing. But she also recognized that Morrison's discovery of correlations between her performance and military training had created significant danger for her continued safety. His panic and defensive reactions suggested that he might take desperate measures to protect himself if he realized that Helen Carter was actually Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, conducting a counterintelligence investigation. The next phase of her mission would require careful coordination with her support team to ensure that Morrison could be arrested and charged before he had opportunities to destroy evidence or threaten her safety. The investigation that had begun 3 years earlier was finally ready to transition from intelligence gathering to law enforcement action. Helen walked Thaw through the administrative building and back toward the weapons facility, maintaining her normal routine while internally preparing for the critical final phase of her undercover mission. Morrison's panic had revealed his guilt, but it had also created new dangers that would require immediate attention from military justice authorities. Behind her, Morrison remained in his office, frantically making phone calls and accessing computer systems in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to destroy evidence and protect himself from the consequences of his crimes. His panic was confirmation that Helen's investigation had been successful, but it also meant that time was running out for safely concluding her mission. The morning sun continued to climb over Fort Bragg as 3 years of careful investigation reached its climactic moment. Helen Carter had maintained her cover identity through harassment, suspicion, and isolation to gather the evidence needed to restore David Carter's honor and bring the real traitor to justice. But Colonel Morrison's discovery of her exceptional abilities had created a dangerous crisis that would test all her training and determination in the final hours of her mission. The ghost of the battlefield was about to emerge from 3 years of hiding to complete the most important operation of her career. The walk back to the weapons facility felt different to Helen as she processed the intelligence gathered from her confrontation with Morrison. His extreme reactions to mentions of David Carter's case had provided confirmation of his guilt, but they had also revealed that her own cover was in serious jeopardy. Morrison's investigation into her background had uncovered correlations that could expose her real identity at any moment. Helen reached the weapons facility and resumed her normal duties, but her awareness was now heightened to detect any changes in personnel behavior or security procedures that might indicate Morrison was taking action based on their conversation. The familiar sounds of military base activity continued around her, but underneath the routine operations, dangerous currents were beginning to flow. Chief Torres looked up from his paperwork as Helen returned to her workstation. "Everything all right, Carter? You look a bit tense after your meeting with the colonel." Helen forced a casual smile while internally calculating how much information she could safely share without compromising her mission. "Just some routine administrative questions about my background verification. Nothing that affects my work status." Torres nodded, but his experienced eye caught subtle signs of stress in Helen's demeanor that suggested the meeting had been more significant than routine administration. After 26 years in the Army, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when personnel were dealing with serious problems. Helen began organizing her tools and preparing for the afternoon maintenance schedule, but her movements were more mechanical than usual as she processed the implications of Morrison's investigation. If military databases had identified correlations between her performance patterns and specialized training records, it was possible that automated analysis systems were already flagging her identity for further investigation. The radio on Torres's desk crackled with base-wide communications traffic, including routine administrative announcements and operational updates. But Helen noticed an increase in communications involving security personnel and military police that suggested heightened alert status across Fort Bragg. Staff Sergeant Webb approached Helen's workstation with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction. "So, Carter, how did your private meeting with the colonel go? Hopefully he's finally taking security concerns seriously." Helen looked up from her tool organization with carefully controlled neutrality. "The colonel wanted to verify some details about my background and training. Nothing that affects my duties here." Webb's smirk suggested he believed the meeting represented validation of his suspicions about Helen's background and loyalty. "I'm sure he's just being thorough about security protocols. Can't be too careful when dealing with people who have questionable associations." The reference to David Carter's conviction was obvious, and Webb's satisfaction indicated he believed Morrison's investigation would eventually result in Helen's removal from the base. What Webb didn't realize was that his harassment had actually provided protective cover for Helen's real mission by making her appear vulnerable and isolated. Helen's shoulder-mounted radio received a priority transmission that immediately captured her attention. "All maintenance personnel report to range control for emergency equipment inspection. Immediate compliance required." The announcement was unusual because equipment inspections were typically scheduled in advance rather than being called as emergency procedures. Helen recognized the possibility that Morrison might be using administrative procedures to isolate her for further interrogation, or worse. Chief Torres looked confused by the unexpected announcement. "Emergency equipment inspection? I wasn't notified of any problems with our maintenance standards or procedures." Helen gathered her essential tools and prepared to comply with the directive, but she also activated additional recording devices concealed in her equipment. If Morrison was orchestrating a confrontation, she wanted to ensure that evidence of his actions would be preserved regardless of what happened to her personally. The movement of personnel toward range control created opportunities for Helen to observe the deployment of security forces across Fort Bragg. Military police vehicles were positioned at strategic locations, and communication traffic suggested that base security was operating under heightened alert procedures. As Helen walked toward range control, she noticed Colonel Morrison's staff car parked near the administrative building, with its engine running. The vehicle's positioning suggested that Morrison was preparing for rapid departure from the base, possibly indicating that he was planning to flee rather than risk further investigation. Range control was located in a secure facility that managed all weapons training and qualification activities at Fort Bragg. The building contained sophisticated communication equipment, ballistics analysis systems, and secure storage for sensitive training materials. It was also an ideal location for conducting private interrogations away from casual observation. Helen entered range control and immediately assessed the tactical situation. Several other maintenance personnel were present, but they appeared confused about the purpose of the emergency inspection. Military police personnel were stationed at exits, and their positioning suggested that the facility was effectively under lockdown. A senior warrant officer Helen didn't recognize approached the assembled maintenance personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're conducting immediate background verification procedures for all personnel with access to sensitive weapons systems. This is a routine security measure, but it requires individual interviews with each team member." The explanation was plausible but suspicious given the timing immediately after Helen's confrontation with Morrison. She recognized the possibility that Morrison was using legitimate security procedures as cover for isolating her from potential allies and witnesses. "Ms. Carter," the warrant officer continued, "please report to interview room 3 for your background verification session." Helen nodded compliance while internally preparing for what could be a final confrontation with Morrison or his agents. The interview room designation suggested a formal interrogation setting where Morrison could confront her with whatever evidence his investigation had produced. Interview room 3 was a small, windowless space designed for conducting sensitive discussions, without risk of surveillance or interruption. The room contained basic furniture arranged to create psychological pressure on subjects, with recording equipment that could document conversations for official purposes. Helen entered the room and was surprised to find it empty, except for a single chair and a small table. But as she moved toward the chair, she heard the distinctive sound of the door lock engaging behind her, confirming that she was now trapped in what could be a dangerous situation. Morrison's voice came through a speaker system built into the room. "Ms. Carter, I apologize for the deception, but recent developments have made it necessary to discuss your situation more directly." Helen looked around the room, identifying the location of recording equipment and communication systems while preparing her response. "Colonel Morrison, if you have questions about my background or qualifications, I'm happy to provide any information you need through proper administrative channels." Morrison's laugh carried no humor, only tension and growing desperation. "Ms. Carter, or should I say Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, I think we're past the point of maintaining your cover story." Helen felt her pulse spike as Morrison revealed knowledge of her real identity. 3 years of careful investigation had been compromised, but she needed to assess how much Morrison actually knew versus how much he was guessing based on incomplete information. "Colonel Morrison," Helen replied, maintaining her civilian persona, "I don't understand what you're talking about. My name is Helen Carter, and I'm a civilian contractor. If you have concerns about my identity, I suggest you contact the appropriate authorities for verification." Morrison's response came immediately, carrying the edge of someone who believed he held decisive advantages. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, my database analysis confirmed that your technical performance patterns match those of a counterintelligence specialist with advanced training in covert operations. Your scope mounting precision, weapons handling procedures, and surveillance detection methods are consistent with someone who graduated from the top 5% of advanced military schools." Helen realized that Morrison's investigation had been more sophisticated than she had anticipated. Modern military databases contained enormous amounts of performance data that could be analyzed to identify correlations between demonstrated capabilities and specific training programs. "Colonel," Helen said, "I think you are making connections that don't exist. Correlation isn't causation, and civilian training can produce capabilities similar to military education." Morrison's voice took on a more threatening tone. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, I know exactly who you are and why you're here. You're conducting an investigation into David Carter's case, and you believe I was involved in his conviction." Helen's mind raced as Morrison's admission confirmed both his knowledge of her identity and his involvement in David Carter's framing. The conversation was being recorded by her concealed devices, providing evidence that could vindicate both her mission and David's memory. "Colonel Morrison," Helen said, deciding to abandon her cover and confront him directly, "if you know who I am, then you understand that I have the authority and resources to investigate crimes against military personnel. Your reaction to my presence suggests you have something to hide." Morrison's pause before responding indicated that Helen's direct challenge had created new pressure for him to consider his options. He had revealed knowledge of her identity, but he had also exposed his own involvement in the conspiracy she was investigating. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell," Morrison finally said, "your investigation threatens to expose sensitive operations that go beyond David Carter's case. There are national security implications that you don't understand." Helen recognized Morrison's attempt to justify his actions by claiming higher authority or classified missions. It was a common defense used by military personnel caught in illegal activities, suggesting that their crimes were actually authorized operations serving national interests. "Colonel Morrison," Helen replied, "there are no national security justifications for framing innocent soldiers or conducting illegal intelligence operations against American military personnel. If you were involved in David Carter's conviction, you committed crimes that demand accountability. Morrison's response revealed increasing desperation, as Helen's confrontation forced him to acknowledge the illegality of his actions. "Lieutenant Colonel, you don't understand the complexity of the situation. David Carter was asking questions that threatened to expose operations involving foreign intelligence cooperation." Helen felt a surge of satisfaction as Morrison began providing details about the conspiracy that had destroyed David Carter's life. His confession was being recorded and would provide definitive proof of the illegal activities that her investigation had been designed to expose. "Colonel Morrison," Helen pressed, "are you saying that David Carter was framed to protect illegal intelligence operations?" Morrison's confession came in a rush of words that revealed 3 years of suppressed guilt and fear. David Carter discovered evidence of unauthorized cooperation with foreign intelligence services. He was going to report violations of operational security and intelligence sharing protocols. We had to discredit him before he could compromise ongoing operations. Helen had the confession she needed, but Morrison's admission also revealed that he was part of a larger conspiracy involving multiple personnel and possibly foreign intelligence services. The implications were far more serious than a single case of wrongful conviction. "Colonel," Helen said, "who else was involved in framing David Carter? You said we had to discredit him, which suggests you weren't acting alone." Morrison realized that his confession had exposed more information than he had intended. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, this conversation needs to end. You're in possession of classified information that threatens ongoing operations." Helen heard sounds of movement outside the interview room that suggested Morrison was preparing to take more direct action against her. The locked door and isolated location meant that she was vulnerable to threats or violence if Morrison became desperate enough to prevent her from reporting his confession. "Colonel Morrison," Helen said, "my investigation has been conducted with full authorization from Military Intelligence Command. Multiple agencies are aware of my mission and expecting regular reports on my progress." It was a bluff designed to discourage Morrison from taking drastic action, but Helen wasn't certain whether he would believe that she had sufficient support to protect her from retaliation. Desperate people often made poor decisions about risk assessment and consequences. Morrison's voice returned through the speaker system, but now it carried a note of finality that suggested he had made decisions about how to handle the crisis. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, I'm going to open this door, and we're going to walk to my office together. You're going to remain silent and cooperative, or this situation will become much more serious." Helen prepared herself for physical confrontation, as Morrison's threat indicated he was willing to use force to control the situation. Her counterintelligence training included extensive preparation for exactly this type of crisis, but being trapped in a small room limited her tactical options. The door lock disengaged with an electronic click, and Morrison entered the room with his sidearm drawn but pointed toward the floor rather than directly at Helen. His expression showed the strain of someone operating under extreme stress and making desperate decisions. "Lieutenant Colonel," Morrison said, "we're going to walk to my office where we can discuss this situation more privately. I need you to understand that there are consequences for interfering with classified operations." Helen stood slowly, keeping her hands visible and non-threatening, while evaluating Morrison's mental state and tactical positioning. He was clearly desperate and armed, but he was also operating without backup, and in a facility where other personnel could potentially intervene. "Colonel Morrison," Helen said, "threatening a federal agent conducting an authorized investigation is a serious crime that will only make your situation worse. I suggest you consider surrendering and cooperating with proper authorities." Morrison's hand tightened on his sidearm as Helen's words reinforced the gravity of his situation. "Lieutenant Colonel, you don't understand what you're dealing with. This goes far beyond David Carter or your investigation." As Morrison gestured for Helen to move toward the door, she heard the distinctive sound of vehicle engines and radio communications that suggested significant activity was developing outside range control. The sounds indicated that security forces were deploying in response to some type of emergency situation. Morrison heard the same sounds, and his expression shifted to panic as he realized that outside forces might be responding to Helen's situation. "What did you do? Who else knows you're here?" Helen maintained steady eye contact with Morrison while internally calculating her options. "Colonel, I told you that my investigation has full authorization and support. Multiple agencies are monitoring this situation." Morrison's panic increased as he realized that Helen's capture might have triggered automatic alerts to her support network. Modern counterintelligence operations included sophisticated communication protocols that provided real-time monitoring of agent safety and mission status. The radio communications outside became more intense, with multiple units reporting positions and requesting instructions. Morrison could hear references to range control and security lockdown procedures that indicated the developing situation involved the facility where he was holding Helen. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell," Morrison said, his voice now showing clear desperation, "we need to resolve this situation quickly. I'm not going to prison for protecting national security interests." Helen recognized that Morrison's desperation was reaching dangerous levels where he might make fatal decisions to protect himself. "Colonel, the best way to resolve this is for you to surrender your weapon and cooperate with investigators. Your confession has already been recorded, and additional violence will only increase your legal problems." Morrison's eyes widened as Helen revealed that their conversation had been documented. "What recording? You don't have authorization to conduct surveillance on military personnel." Helen smiled slightly as Morrison's question revealed his failure to understand counterintelligence procedures. "Colonel, as a federal agent investigating crimes against military personnel, I have broad authorization to gather evidence using appropriate methods." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside indicated that security personnel were approaching range control, possibly in response to automated alerts from Helen's recording devices or predetermined check-in procedures with her support team. Morrison moved toward the door while keeping his sidearm trained on Helen. "We're leaving through the back exit. Any attempt to signal for help will have serious consequences." Helen followed Morrison's instructions while mentally preparing for opportunities to escape or signal for assistance. The approaching footsteps suggested that help was nearby, but Morrison's desperation made him extremely dangerous in the short term. As they moved through range control toward the rear exit, Helen could see through windows that military police vehicles were positioned around the building perimeter. The deployment pattern suggested that security forces were conducting a coordinated response to a known crisis rather than routine patrol activities. Morrison noticed the security presence, and his panic reached critical levels. "This is impossible. How did they respond so quickly?" Helen decided to increase Morrison's psychological pressure by revealing more information about her mission support. "Colonel, counterintelligence operations include real-time monitoring and automatic response protocols. Your confession triggered immediate alerts to multiple agencies." Morrison pushed open the rear exit door and immediately found himself facing 3 military police officers with weapons drawn and trained on his position. "Drop your weapon immediately. Place your hands where we can see them." The confrontation Helen had been anticipating for 3 years was finally occurring, but Morrison's desperation made the situation extremely volatile. He was trapped between surrender and the consequences of his crimes, holding a weapon while facing superior firepower from professional law enforcement personnel. "Colonel Morrison," the lead MP shouted, "you are surrounded and outgunned. Drop your weapon and surrender immediately." Morrison's hand trembled as he held his sidearm, his mind clearly struggling with impossible choices. Surrender meant facing courts-martial and prison for treason and conspiracy, but resistance against multiple armed officers would be suicidal. Helen saw an opportunity to de-escalate the situation while ensuring Morrison's surrender. "Colonel, your only option is to surrender and cooperate with investigators. Additional violence will not change the evidence against you or improve your legal situation." Morrison's resolve finally broke under the combined pressure of armed officers and the futility of his situation. He slowly lowered his sidearm and placed it on the ground, then raised his hands in surrender. "I surrender," Morrison said, his voice barely audible. "I want to speak with an attorney." The military police officers immediately moved to secure Morrison and his weapon, while maintaining tactical awareness in case other threats were present. Their professionalism and efficiency demonstrated the high quality of law enforcement training at Fort Bragg. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell," the lead MP said, "are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" Helen felt tremendous relief as her true identity was acknowledged and her safety was assured. "I'm unharmed, Sergeant." Colonel Morrison made incriminating statements about David Carter's case that were recorded on authorized surveillance equipment. The MP nodded and began coordinating with additional security personnel who were arriving to process the crime scene and secure evidence. "Ma'am, we'll need your recording devices and a complete statement about Colonel Morrison's actions and admissions." As Morrison was placed in custody and read his rights, Helen observed the systematic professionalism of military justice procedures. Every step was documented, All evidence was properly secured, and Morrison's constitutional rights were protected despite his serious crimes. The transition from the chaotic scene at Range Control to the sterile silence of the Criminal Investigation Division's high-security interrogation wing was jarring. Morrison sat alone in Interview Room 1, a cold, windowless box that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. They had stripped him of his belt, his shoelaces, and his rank insignia, a standard suicide prevention protocol that also served to strip a man of his dignity. For 45 minutes, Morrison had stewed in that silence, his initial panic hardening into a brittle arrogance. He was Colonel Richard Morrison, the base commander of Fort Bragg. He had friends in the Pentagon. He had connections that these low-level MPs couldn't even imagine. He convinced himself that this was a misunderstanding, or perhaps a political play that he could maneuver his way out of. He rehearsed his opening lines. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with?" And, "I demand to speak to the JAG Corps General Counsel immediately." The heavy steel door buzzed and clicked open. Morrison straightened his spine, preparing to bark orders at whatever junior investigator walked through the door. "About time. I want you to know that this illegal detainment will end your—" The words died in his throat. Walking through the door wasn't a nervous CID agent or a military lawyer. It was Helen Carter. But the grease-stained coveralls and the smell of CLP gun oil were gone. The diffident, quiet demeanor of the civilian contractor had evaporated. Standing before him was a woman wearing the immaculate Army service uniform of a lieutenant colonel. The deep blue jacket was tailored perfectly, the silver oak leaves on her shoulders catching the harsh fluorescent light. On her chest sat a formidable rack of ribbons that Morrison recognized with a jolt of shock. Defense Superior Service Medal, Bronze Star with V device, and the distinct ribbon of the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. She didn't look like a mechanic. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered its prey. She carried a thick, classified dossier under one arm and a tablet in the other. Without a word, she pulled out the metal chair opposite him and sat down, her movements possessing that same terrifying economy he had noticed in the workshop. Only now, he recognized it for what it was, the precise, calculated motion of an elite operator. "Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell," Morrison whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Defense Intelligence Agency." "Good afternoon, prisoner," she said. Her voice was unrecognizable. Gone was the soft, deferential tone of Helen the Widow. This voice was cold steel, authoritative, and utterly devoid of empathy. "We have a lot to cover, and very little time before the federal prosecutors arrive to formally charge you with high treason." Morrison tried to rally his defenses. He leaned forward, attempting to summon the ghost of his command authority. "You can't do this, Mitchell. You entrapped me. That recording was obtained without a warrant in a secure facility. It's inadmissible. Any lawyer fresh out of school will tear it apart." She didn't blink. She simply placed the tablet on the table and tapped the screen. A document appeared, a FISA warrant signed by a federal judge, dated 3 years prior, authorizing full-spectrum surveillance on Richard Morrison and his associates. "We didn't need a new warrant for today, Richard," she said, using his first name with deliberate disrespect. "You've been under Title III electronic surveillance for 36 months. We have audio of you accepting the bribes. We have video of your meetings in D.C. with the attaché from the embassy. We have the encrypted emails you sent from your personal laptop." She slid the tablet across the table. It displayed a grainy but unmistakable photo of Morrison accepting a briefcase from a man in a park. "October 14th. You sold the specs for the new drone guidance system. The price was $50,000. Cheap, Richard. You sold out your country for the price of a mid-range sedan." Morrison's face turned an ashen gray. He stared at the photo, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. That was a consulting fee for post-retirement work. "And the Shell Corporation in the Cayman Islands? Apex Consulting?" Sarah asked, opening the dossier and pulling out a complex financial flowchart. "We tracked the money laundering, Richard. We know about the payments to Staff Sergeant Webb to falsify inventory records. We know about the payoffs to the supply officers." Morrison flinched at Webb's name. "Webb is an idiot. He doesn't know anything. Webb is currently in Interview Room 4, Sarah lied smoothly, her poker face impenetrable. "He's singing like a bird. He claims you ordered him to harass me to drive me off the base because I was asking too many questions about the inventory discrepancies. He says you threatened his pension if he didn't comply. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma, and Sarah watched the cracks form in Morrison's resolve. He was sweating now, a sheen of perspiration breaking out on his forehead despite the chill in the room. I was protecting the base, Morrison stammered, pivoting to the national security defense he had tried earlier. David Carter. He was unstable. He was going to leak sensitive data. I had to stop him. Sarah's eyes narrowed, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Do not say his name. You don't get to say his name. She pulled a photograph from the file, a picture of David Carter in his dress uniform, smiling, holding his daughter. She slammed it onto the metal table with a sound like a gunshot. David Carter discovered that you were shipping serialized weapon parts to black market buyers in Eastern Europe, Sarah stated, laying out the facts with brutal precision. He found the discrepancies in the logistics database. He came to you, trusting his commander, believing it was a clerical error, and instead of fixing it, you reached out to your handlers and asked them how to silence him. Morrison shrank back in his chair. I didn't tell them to kill him. I just wanted him discredited. You framed a master sergeant for treason, Sarah continued, her voice rising with controlled intensity. You planted the files on his computer. You forged the bank transfers. You stood in the courtroom and testified against a man who regarded you as a mentor. And when he was beaten to death in Leavenworth by an inmate paid off by your associates, you didn't even send flowers to his funeral. I had no choice, Morrison shouted, his composure shattering. They threatened me, the people I was working for. You don't understand, Mitchell. They have reach. If I didn't deliver Carter, they were going to expose me. And who are they, Richard? Sarah asked softly. The trap was set. This was the moment. Because right now, you are looking at 25 years to life in a federal supermax. But the Department of Justice might consider taking the death penalty off the table if you give us the network. Not the small fish. I want the handlers. I want the names of the other officers you compromised. Morrison looked at the mirror on the wall, knowing his reflection was just a facade for the cameras recording every twitch of his face. He looked back at Sarah, the woman he had dismissed as a grieving, incompetent mechanic for 3 years. He realized now that he had been living in a cage with a tiger, mistaking it for a house cat. He slumped, his arrogance finally dissolving into total defeat. If I talk, I need protection, witness protection, for my family. You're in no position to negotiate terms, Sarah said, pulling a notepad from her pocket. But if the intel is good, I'll speak to the prosecutor. Start talking. Who is the contact at the embassy? Viktor Volkov, Morrison whispered. He runs the logistics desk, but he's not the top. There's a general at the Pentagon. In procurement. Sarah's pen paused. This was it, the thread that would unravel the entire sweater. Name, she commanded. General Sterling, Morrison choked out. He's the one who introduced me to Volkov. He takes a cut of every shipment. Sarah wrote the name down, her face impassive, though internally she felt a surge of triumph. General Sterling was untouchable, until now. With Morrison's testimony and the financial records she had gathered, they could take down a corruption ring that spanned 3 continents. She stood up, gathering her files. The interrogation was effectively over. The JAG lawyers and FBI agents would handle the formal deposition. She had what she needed. You know the irony, Richard? Sarah said, looking down at the broken man in the orange jumpsuit. You spent 3 years worrying that I was incompetent, that I would blow up a rifle or mess up a scope. You were so focused on my hands that you never looked at my eyes. She walked to the door and signaled the guard. Wait, Morrison pleaded, his voice trembling. What happens to me now? Sarah paused in the doorway, the silhouette of the ghost of the battlefield framed by the harsh hallway light. Now? She said, her voice echoing the finality of a judge's gavel. Now you disappear, and David Carter gets his name back. The heavy steel door slammed shut, leaving Morrison alone with his reflection and the crushing weight of his choices. The next several hours at Fort Bragg were consumed with evidence processing, witness interviews, and coordination between multiple military justice agencies. Helen's 3 years of undercover investigation had produced extensive documentation of Morrison's criminal activities, but translating that evidence into successful prosecution required careful attention to legal procedures. Helen was debriefed by counterintelligence specialists who documented every aspect of her investigation and Morrison's confession. The recording devices she had used provided clear audio evidence of Morrison's admission that David Carter had been framed to protect illegal intelligence operations. The evidence review revealed that Morrison's conspiracy involved unauthorized cooperation with foreign intelligence services and violations of multiple federal laws governing military operations. David Carter's discovery of these illegal activities had made him a target for elimination, leading to the fabricated treason charges that destroyed his life. Military investigators worked through the night to analyze 3 years of evidence that Helen had gathered during her undercover assignment. Every document, recording, and observation was cataloged and prepared for use in courts-martial proceedings against Morrison and any co-conspirators who could be identified. Chief Torres was among the personnel interviewed about Helen's performance during her time as a civilian contractor. His testimony provided important context about her exceptional technical skills and professional behavior that had initially raised Morrison's suspicions. "I knew Carter was exceptionally skilled," Torres told investigators, "but I never suspected she was an undercover officer. Her cover identity was completely convincing, and her dedication to the work was genuine." Staff Sergeant Webb was also interviewed, though his testimony revealed his own prejudices and unfounded suspicions rather than providing useful intelligence about the actual conspiracy. His harassment of Helen had inadvertently provided cover for her investigation by making her appear vulnerable and isolated. "I thought she was suspicious because of her husband's conviction," Webb admitted to investigators. "I never considered that she might be investigating the people who framed him." The investigation expanded rapidly as Morrison's confession led to examination of other personnel who might have been involved in the conspiracy. Military intelligence databases were searched for evidence of unauthorized foreign contacts and illegal intelligence sharing that Morrison had referenced during his breakdown. Helen's real service record was finally revealed to Fort Bragg personnel who had known her only as a civilian contractor. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell's distinguished career included multiple classified operations and commendations for exceptional service in counterintelligence activities. The revelation that Helen Carter was actually a decorated military officer conducting an authorized investigation created significant impact throughout Fort Bragg. Personnel who had witnessed Webb's harassment felt shame about their failure to intervene, while others expressed admiration for her dedication and professionalism. As evidence processing continued, the scope of Morrison's criminal activities became clear. He had indeed been cooperating with foreign intelligence services, providing classified information in exchange for payments that he had concealed through sophisticated financial schemes. David Carter's discovery of Morrison's illegal activities had occurred during a routine security audit that identified suspicious communication patterns and unexplained financial transactions. Carter's intention to report his findings through proper channels had triggered Morrison's decision to frame him for treason. The evidence showed that Morrison had fabricated documents and manipulated witnesses to create the appearance that David Carter was selling secrets to foreign agents. The conspiracy had been sophisticated enough to fool military investigators and result in Carter's conviction and subsequent death in prison. Helen's investigation had methodically uncovered the truth through 3 years of patient intelligence gathering and careful documentation. Her success in exposing Morrison's crimes would restore David Carter's reputation and provide closure for a family destroyed by false accusations. The military justice process moved forward with courts-martial proceedings against Morrison and several co-conspirators who were identified during the expanded investigation. The evidence Helen had gathered would be crucial in securing convictions and ensuring appropriate punishment for their crimes. Military leadership at Fort Bragg issued public statements acknowledging that David Carter had been wrongfully convicted and expressing regret for the injustice that had destroyed his life and reputation. The apology was formal recognition that military justice systems had failed in Carter's case. A special ceremony was organized to restore David Carter's honor and recognize Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's exceptional service in uncovering the truth. The ceremony would include presentation of posthumous awards for Carter and public recognition of Mitchell's courage and dedication. Helen participated in planning the ceremony while processing her own emotions about the successful conclusion of her 3-year mission. The investigation had been personally challenging, requiring her to endure harassment and suspicion while maintaining focus on her ultimate objective. The ceremony took place on the main parade ground at Fort Bragg, with hundreds of military personnel in attendance to witness the restoration of David Carter's honor. The formal military setting provided appropriate dignity for acknowledging the injustice that had been corrected. Helen wore her military uniform for the first time in 3 years, displaying the rank and decorations that reflected her distinguished service record. The transformation from civilian contractor to decorated officer was dramatic evidence of her successful undercover mission. Base Commander General Patricia Williams presided over the ceremony, delivering remarks that acknowledged both the injustice done to David Carter and the exceptional service performed by Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell in uncovering the truth. "Today we correct a grievous wrong," General Williams announced to the assembled formation. Master Sergeant David Carter was a loyal soldier who died believing his own military had abandoned him. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell spent 3 years of her life ensuring that truth would ultimately prevail. David Carter's posthumous awards included restoration of his rank and benefits, along with recognition that his death in prison was the result of criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate conviction for treason. The military justice system had failed him, but it was now acknowledging that failure publicly. Helen accepted recognition for her undercover investigation, but her remarks focused on David Carter's vindication rather than her own accomplishments. Master Sergeant Carter maintained his innocence until the day he died. Today, the military he served with honor finally acknowledges that he was telling the truth. Morrison's conviction and sentencing provided formal justice for his crimes, but Helen knew that no legal proceeding could restore David Carter's life or repair the damage done to his family. The best she could accomplish was ensuring that his name was cleared and his service was properly honored. The ceremony concluded with the placement of David Carter's name on Fort Bragg's memorial wall, recognizing his service and sacrifice while acknowledging the injustice of his wrongful conviction. His Purple Heart and other decorations were restored to honor status. Helen stood at attention as the base formation rendered honors to David Carter's memory. The soldiers who had served under Morrison's command now understood that they had been led by a traitor who had destroyed an innocent man to protect his own criminal activities. The flag ceremony included lowering and raising the American flag to half-staff and back to full position, symbolizing the military's acknowledgement of error and commitment to upholding justice. The formal military ritual provided appropriate solemnity for the occasion. Following the ceremony, Helen met with David Carter's surviving family members who had traveled to Fort Bragg for the vindication of their loved one's memory. The meeting was emotional but healing, providing closure for relatives who had maintained faith in David's innocence despite his conviction. "Thank you for never giving up," David's sister told Helen. "We knew he wasn't a traitor, but we had no way to prove it. Your investigation gave us back our brother's honor." Helen's response was simple but heartfelt. Master Sergeant Carter died protecting his country's secrets from real traitors. The least I could do was ensure the truth was revealed. The administrative processing following Morrison's conviction included comprehensive review of all cases he had been involved in during his career. Military investigators wanted to ensure that no other innocent personnel had been victimized by his criminal activities. Helen's transition back to regular military duties required adjustment after 3 years of living under deep cover. The psychological challenges of maintaining a false identity for extended periods were recognized by military medical personnel who provided appropriate support services. The counterintelligence community studied Helen's investigation as a model for future undercover operations involving military personnel. Her success in maintaining cover while gathering decisive evidence provided valuable lessons for training future agents. Fort Bragg implemented new security procedures designed to prevent the kind of criminal conspiracy that Morrison had operated for years. The reforms included enhanced oversight of personnel with access to classified information and improved detection systems for unauthorized activities. Helen remained at Fort Bragg for several months to assist with ongoing investigations and ensure complete resolution of all issues related to Morrison's criminal activities. Her expertise and institutional knowledge were valuable resources for military investigators. The final phase of evidence processing revealed the full scope of Morrison's betrayal, including specific intelligence that had been compromised and operations that had been endangered by his illegal activities. The damage assessment required coordination with multiple intelligence agencies. Helen's service record was updated to reflect her exceptional performance during the undercover investigation. The commendations she received recognized both her professional competence and personal courage, in conducting such a challenging and dangerous mission. David Carter's family established a scholarship fund in his memory to support military families affected by wrongful accusations or criminal misconduct. The fund would provide resources for legal defense and family support during investigations and legal proceedings. Helen contributed to the scholarship fund and participated in its annual awards ceremony, maintaining her commitment to supporting military families who faced challenges similar to what David Carter's relatives had endured. The military justice reforms implemented after Morrison's conviction included enhanced protections for whistleblowers and improved procedures for investigating allegations of criminal misconduct by senior personnel. The changes were designed to prevent future cases like David Carter's. Helen's final report on the investigation documented lessons learned and recommendations for improving counterintelligence operations. Her insights were incorporated into training programs and operational procedures used by military intelligence agencies. 6 months after Morrison's conviction, Helen received orders for her next assignment with Military Intelligence Command. Her success at Fort Bragg had established her reputation as one of the military's most effective counterintelligence specialists. The day before her departure from Fort Bragg, Helen visited David Carter's memorial wall placement one final time. The bronze nameplate bearing his name and service record was properly positioned among other soldiers who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. A small challenge coin was placed at the base of David Carter's memorial nameplate, bearing the inscription Ghost 77, Helen's operational designation during her investigation. The coin would remain as a symbol of her commitment to finding truth and ensuring justice. Helen's departure from Fort Bragg marked the end of her most significant professional accomplishment, but she knew that David Carter's vindication was more important than any personal recognition she might receive. Justice had been served through professional investigation and proper legal procedures. The military community at Fort Bragg had learned important lessons about the dangers of criminal conspiracy within their ranks and the importance of supporting personnel who report misconduct through proper channels. Morrison's conviction sent a clear message about accountability. Helen's counterintelligence career continued with new assignments and challenges, but her success in exposing Morrison's conspiracy established her reputation as someone willing to pursue truth, regardless of personal cost or professional risk. The ghost of the battlefield had completed her most important mission, restoring honor to an innocent soldier and bringing justice to those who had betrayed their oaths and their country. David Carter's memory was finally protected by the truth that Helen